It's now time for our special guest. We're delighted to have with us tonight Dr. Jonathan Balcom. Dr. Balcom is an animal behavior expert who is also a passionate advocate for the protection of animals and their living spaces. He is the author of the best-selling Pleasurable Kingdom, Animals and the Nature of Feeling Good, available in 5 foreign editions, and Second Nature, The Inner Lives of Animals. His latest book, The Exultant Ark, a pictorial tour of animal pleasure, is due to come out in just a few weeks. Dr. Balcom's message resonates with timely issues including climate change, biodiversity, and personal health that affect everyone. Dr. Balcom is on the faculty of the Humane Society University and is a dynamic, much sought-after speaker who has given invited presentations on 6 continents. Dr. Balcom's presentation tonight is entitled, Why Vegan? Lessons from an Animal Scientist. Please welcome Dr. Jonathan Balcom.
Thank you, Lorraine. Also want to thank Orianne Lee, who is conveniently right here, so I can sing. I just stepped on her toes.
Oops. Okay, shoot. It's the other side, sorry.
Oh. It's a real lesson here.
Okay, I need to give you a kiss.
Thank you. I think I must speak here more often. Yeah, I want to thank those 2 people for helping to arrange me to be here. It's wonderful to come back to Hawaii. The last time I was here was not recent. It was in 1967. I was not yet an adult. But I still remember stretch limousines, sea cucumber, thank you, and my brother making an ill-timed dive into the surf and landing face first into the sand. Those are my 3 memories from Honolulu in 1967. I'm going to start out with just a little story about me. Many years before I became a macho biologist, in fact, at about age 9, I used to go to a summer camp north of Toronto, and my favorite place there was some wetland ditches on either side of the railroad tracks. It sounds very grim. Just in front of the lake. I used to go down there if I had a moment between chores and hang out before the swim session. I would find frogs, whirligig beetles, dragonflies, and if it was a particularly good day, I might even find a snake. One day, a scruffy, thin man ambled along the tracks, the railroad tracks. In one hand, he had a long pole and a dip net and a heavy sack weighted down with something, and in the other hand, he held a leopard frog. And he walked up to me and he asked me if I would hold this frog for him. I was a compliant 9-year-old boy, so I took the frog and held it in my hand as he waded off into the ditch to catch more frogs. And I figured what was in that heavy sack was other frogs, and I didn't like their prospects. And as I stood there looking at this frog in my hand, I began to see things from the frog's perspective, and an overwhelming urge overtook me to let the frog go. So I did. The man returned, saw what I'd done, was very angry. I learned a few new swear words that day, and then he ambled off in his way. I don't know what the fate of those frogs was, but I felt like I'd done the right thing then, and I do believe today that I did the right thing to let that frog go. The chances are those frogs were probably going to be used for fishing bait, or perhaps they might end up in biology classrooms, where to this day large numbers of frogs are cut up as part of almost a rite of passage for 7th graders, typically in America and elsewhere in the world, but particularly the U.S., so that kids can learn things like where are the intestines, and what does the gastrocnemius muscle look like, and where's the stomach in relation to the spleen, for instance, and what does the tongue look like. They will also learn the oldest lesson in the book when it comes to our relationship to animals, and that is that they were put here for us, and we can do with them as we please. I use the term might makes right to describe this sort of ethical viewpoint, if you like, or perhaps we might say unethical viewpoint, a way of looking at other individuals. We have the power to lord it over them and do with them as we please, and so we do. Now, might makes right has a rich history in human behavior. It underscored long-term colonialism that European countries had over other countries in the world, marched in and essentially took over and told people what to do for those who took them over. The African slave trade is another profound illustration of might makes right. The subjugation of women's rights and the denial of civil rights are all illustrations, human illustrations, of this might makes right way of thinking. Fortunately, we've done a great deal to relegate these past social wrongs to the history books. But there's one huge moral sphere in which we continue to function according to a might makes right way of thinking, and that, of course, is in our treatment of animals, and that's going to be the focus of my talk today. Just as a brief summary of this might makes right thinking, recreational hunting, sport hunting, consumes over 100 million animals a year, and fishing, another very large number. Some 50 million are killed for their fur. We deprive little primates and other animals of their mothers and put them in cages to satisfy our scientific curiosity. We may put moon bears in crush cages for decades so that we can drain bile to be used in Chinese medicine. And of course, huge numbers, estimated 9 to 10 billion in the United States per year, are caught up in the factory farming system so that we can buy cheap eggs, and large numbers of chickens, again a chicken illustration, are kept in these types of sheds with nothing really resembling the normal life that they would typically have, the social life, the sun on their backs, etc., so that we can have cheap meat. And the rate of chicken consumption in the U.S. is 300 per second we kill. So pretty astonishing numbers. As vegetarians, some of you may already know these numbers. The veal farms, we deprive calves of their mothers and mothers of their calves so that we can have cheap milk, and the reward for the mother at the end of about 4 or 5 cycles of artificial insemination and having her baby taken away from her on day 1 is to be sent to the slaughterhouse. Okay, that's my brief review of the nasty side of our relationship with animals. Most of the slides you will see from now on will be nice and agreeable pictures of animals. Well, what's wrong with this? What's wrong with all of that little litany that I just gave? Well, the problem is, the crux of it is that animals feel. They are sentient. They have the capacity for pain, and they have the capacity for pleasure. They can feel suffering, extended suffering, and they can experience joy. And the way I like to put it is, sentience is the bedrock of ethics. The foundation of moral systems is that others matter, that they have lives that matter to them. Not just lives that matter to me, materialistically or in a utilitarian sense, but lives that are important to them, intrinsic value. Animals qualify as sentient. We may argue where we draw the line, draw it in pencil. It's a difficult line to draw, but I think there's not much question about, say, a bovine and a canine being sentient. They take an interest in their surroundings. They are sentient beings. So I'm now going to take you on a little bit of a tour, if you like. It's a truncated tour. There's much more that could be said. If you want more information about it, check out Second Nature, The Inner Lives of Animals, the green-covered book that isn't here yet, but it hopefully will be available later in the week. And of course, it is available on Amazon and many bookstores. So I'm going to go through a little tour about some of the mostly recent discoveries about animal sentience. And this is a very exciting time to be an ethologist, which is my field, the study of animal behavior. Because for much of the 20th century, science was silent on questions of what animals are thinking and how they're feeling. It was considered taboo to even ask questions about animal minds, animal emotions, animal experiences. To this day, most journal articles on animal behavior don't go there, don't discuss those things. But there's a growing number of scientists and scientific studies that are probing these interesting questions. So most of the science I'm going to share with you now is fairly recent. Hands up if you've ever lived with a cat or a dog, and then hands up if you think that they are not emotional. I think I've only had one hand go up, and it was in a school. It's a bit tentative. It's tough to go against the grain, but suffice it to say that most of the general public doesn't need much convincing that some animals, such as cats and dogs, are emotional. I'll give you one anecdote from my own experience. One of my 2 cats, Micah, was so traumatized following a visit to the vet that he went on a hunger strike and spent 40 hours upstairs and didn't come down to be fed, I should say. To be eaten would be a good reason to stay upstairs. It was an interesting sort of pseudo-Freudian slip there. The intriguing thing is that he wasn't even the one who'd been to the vet. It was his sister, Megan, here on the left. She'd been to the vet. So by some sort of emotional osmosis, her coming home with the smell, the carrying cage, all that stuff, he'd been there before. Cats hate change. If you've lived with cats, they absolutely loathe disruption of their normal schedule. And so he was absolutely freaked. You know, I don't like going to the dentist. I don't like taking a cat to the vet, or the doctor particularly, but I do not go on hunger strikes when I've been there. So it's an illustration really of an important point, that animals, we always tend to hold ourselves up at the top of the pyramid, and the others are all kind of lesser than us. Oh yeah, they're emotional, not as much as us, but they're emotional. No, I think in many realms we need to realize that we're just sort of in the pack, and some other animals may be more acutely emotional and more responsive in a sensory way to other things than we are. One of the reasons why science has been agnostic on questions about emotion and feelings is that these are private experiences. They're very difficult to demonstrate scientifically, but they're not impossible. And some of the studies I'll present to you briefly sort of show that that can be done. We can probe the inner lives of animals, but how are these sea lions feeling? They look amorous, and indeed it was a male and a female. This picture appears in my new pictorial book, The Exultant Ark, and I questioned the photographer. I asked him, what was it like? I wasn't there. It's a still photo. What were you seeing? And he said, it got a little rough at times, but they're thick-skinned animals, and they were frolicking, and it looked to me amorous. It looked romantic. These are long-lived mammals. So love, perhaps it's in my love chapter. But this is one of the reasons why science has been agnostic, is that these experiences are private. But here's a couple of examples of recent studies that show interesting phenomena, emotional phenomena, long-term emotions in animals. We know that the loss of an infant, a woman losing her child, it's a terribly traumatic thing. We know it's a grievous loss. And that loss is shown physiologically and behaviorally. One of the physiological changes is that glucocorticoid hormones go up in the bloodstream, and they stay elevated for a month or so, and then they begin to subside. And our closest relatives and friends, family members, we feel the grief too. It's sort of back to that emotional osmosis, or just the shared emotion of the loss, the terrible loss. Baboons show a similar pattern. It used to be that to get hormones out of a baboon, you had to catch him and draw blood. Well, that's got all kinds of problems because you're stressing the animal. That's going to change the hormone balance. But now we have the technology that we can actually examine their poop and get the hormone levels from that. Much less invasive. It doesn't freak the baboon out. And this is a long-term study of baboons, a Jane Goodall type study for decades, generations. They know individuals. They know who's aunt and uncle and son and etc. Well, cut to the chase. A baboon mother who's lost an infant to predation or disease, she shows the same pattern of glucocorticoid hormone elevation in the bloodstream that women show. And it lasts about a month, and then it subsides. And the closest associates in the troop or the community of baboons shows a similar rise, not as much, but it goes up. And then there's the behavioral response. Humans, we send flowers, we express moral support, make some soup and bring it over to the grieving person, the one who's most bereaved. Baboons, as far as I know, haven't been shown to send flowers or make soup for each other, but they show a different behavioral response. They expand their social networks. They groom each other more. Mothers who've lost an infant spend a significantly greater amount of time engaging in grooming, giving it and receiving it. And we all know that a good massage is very de-stressing. It's comforting to us. It releases dopamine and oxytocin into the bloodstream. So essentially, this is a form of therapy, and that's the term the scientists use to cope with the bereavement. Another term the scientists use, by the way, a term that 50 years ago would be considered heretical to use in application to a baboon. Now we have terms like bereavement and therapy. The other study I want to mention very briefly, a study of starlings, shows that caged birds become pessimistic. Birds who, on the other hand, are living in, albeit captive, but a very rich, large aviary. They can fly around. They've got lots of food to sample. They have social company. They have a much more optimistic outlook on life. They will try something new. The pessimistic birds in the tiny cage all by themselves will be very unlikely to try something new. I'm not going to describe the very clever way of showing that experimentally. I describe it in the book. But I think these two studies, they undercut a common assumption we make about animals. And this is the idea that they only live in the moment. It's just here and now for them. But we're talking about bereavement that lasts a month or more in a baboon. We're talking about things like pessimism and optimism in a bird. So we've got a mammal and a bird example here. We're talking about moods and dispositions, emotional tenors, feelings that last hours, days, weeks, maybe even months. And so I think that raises, if you like, the emotional profile of an animal. We have to realize that we're talking about a pretty vulnerable creature emotionally. Let's go on to perceptions. Sentience relates to sensory capacity. So the sensitivity of your senses, if you're particularly sensitive in a realm, hearing, smell, touch, sight, whatever, that suggests that you may be particularly sensitive to pains and pleasures as well. So I think it's a very important point to make, and I have a chapter dedicated to this in Second Nature, and let me just give a couple of examples. Animals, they have different ways, they have different Umwelts, to use a German term. It means sensory worlds. They relate to their world in different ways, some more profoundly than others. We can relate to the rainbow lorikeets here. They're birds, they're very visual. But bats, my goodness, How do they orient? Well, they orient by echolocation, these kinds of bats, and that's almost an alien idea for us. We have radar and sonar. It's not nearly as sophisticated as their echolocation, but it's an example of an animal who lives in a relatively somewhat alien sensory world. They have excellent hearing, of course, have to be able to hear echoes and determine what information from echoes. And then we have fish, who are sort of in the middle there. D.H. Lawrence, the poet, described them. I love his line. He said, a fish's life is a sluice of sensation along its sides. So they're probably a tactile animal. I went snorkeling in Hanauma Bay yesterday and saw fishes touching each other in ways that were probably pleasurable, and I get into that in the book. Suffice it to say that there's a diversity of different sensory worlds, but animals are perceptive in their own realms. Things that are meaningful to them, they're good at. It used to be thought that chimpanzees had poor face recognition skills compared to humans until someone had the bright idea to actually test them on other chimpanzee faces. This was a little bit anthropocentric on our part. Well, we look at our faces and we say, well, look how distinctive we are. We recognize that we're different. Chimps kind of look all the same to us by comparison. Well, we're not chimps and we don't live among them. Let's test them on chimp faces. And lo and behold, when they're tested on chimp faces, they have a very similar ability to recognize faces. In fact, it's probably a little bit superior. They're very good at recognizing kinship as well. And they're definitely better than us at recognizing upside-down faces. And if you think about the biology of chimps and some of their behavior, it comes to light. It's explainable as to why they would be better at that than we are. Animal minds, cognition. This is something that's become very popular now among scientists to study. And again, it was another one of those taboos for much of the last century. Darwin was really the last one to write about some of this stuff in the 19th century, and then we went to sleep for a few decades, and then a guy named Donald Griffin, an American ethologist, started writing about animal minds and animal thinking in the 1970s, by the way, right about the same time that Peter Singer's Animal Liberation came out. So there's sort of a joint, almost in concert, rise of interest in animal rights and animals as ethical beings, ethically considerable entities, and the study of aspects of animal existence that was being ignored before. So here's just a couple of examples of cognition. This is a scrub jay. It's a corvid. We don't have them right here, but it's an American species. Scrub jays, let me just describe briefly a study of scrub jays that shows they have episodic memory. That is the ability to remember the what, the when, and the where of a past event. Scrub jays like peanuts and waxworms to eat. They prefer waxworms, but waxworms have a shorter shelf life. They don't last as long. They become rotten in about 5 days, whereas peanuts will last for a week, 2 weeks before they become unpalatable. The other thing is that scrub jays are caching species. That is, they bury food and they come back to get it later. If you think about that, well, that requires some cognition, because if you don't have the memory for where you buried it, you're not going to be very successful, and your genes for memory are not going to be passed on in the next generation, because you're going to go hungry and be beaten out by those who have better memories. Think about it, and you know that squirrels, those lowly rodents that we often dismiss as lower mammals, squirrels obviously are pretty good at cognition when it comes to memory, because they have to be able to remember things. Well, in this study, they gave scrub jays individually, one at a time, access to one arena on the right, and then they gave them a little bowl of peanuts. They were already full, so they weren't motivated to eat. They wanted to bury, and they buried the peanuts on that side. So you guys are the peanuts. Don't take offense. And then on the other side, then a little bit later that day, they gave them waxworms, and they gave them access, not to that one anymore, that was closed off, but they had access to another arena. So you're waxworms. And then, depending on how much time elapsed between the burying, the caching, and when they were allowed back for access to both arenas at the same time, they were more or less inclined to go to one side. And you can probably figure out which it would be. If it was, say, a day later or 2 days later, waxworms, that's the side they want to go to. They're not rotten yet. It's only been a couple of days. It's almost like they're wearing a watch and keeping time. 5 days later and up, they didn't go to the waxworm side, they went to the peanut side. Now, if you're a little bit cynical or skeptical, which is very good, very scientific of you, you're going to ask the question, well, wait a minute here, maybe they could smell the rotten waxworms, and scientists have to take control for these kind of eventualities that could otherwise explain and not require any memory. So what they did was, after 5 days, they replaced the rotten waxworms with fresh ones, and replaced the sand so the sand wouldn't smell bad. Still, the birds would go back to the peanut side after day 5. So these are animals remembering what they buried, peanuts or waxworms, where they buried them, waxworms, peanuts, and how long ago they buried them. And by the way, you have to add who now to the what, where, and when. They also know who's burying what. They know when they buried it. They recognize individuals in their society, even though they all look pretty much the same to us. Well, back to the chimpanzees. We're not scrub jays. We don't have good scrub jay recognition skills. I'm a bird watcher. I can recognize a scrub jay, but that's about it. But they keep an eye on who's watching them when they're burying, because sometimes some of these scrub jays become pilferers. They will rob, they will go and steal buried items from other scrub jays. Interestingly, scrub jays scrub jays, knowing they're being watched, will often come back quickly and when the other bird's gone for a while, and they'll exhume the peanut or the treat and bury it somewhere else. Only, however, if they themselves are pilferers. If they're experienced with taking caches from other birds, they know. So it takes a thief to know one, essentially, in these scrub jay societies. So it's almost in fact, it is Machiavellian. It's not almost Machiavellian. It is Machiavellian. A small mammal, very common, the meadow vole. I don't think they have them in Hawaii. I know they don't have them in Hawaii, but they're very numerous. There's probably a few billion of them in North America. Another rodent, a small rodent at that. Cognitive? Absolutely. They also show episodic memory. I don't have time to describe the study, but it's a different type of study, but it shows that they remember the when, where, and what of a past event. And by the way, mice, they have an interesting social behavior that wouldn't be very popular among us. They leave a urine trail wherever they go. That's a little identification key. That's a bit sort of almost a courtesy to say, I've just been there, and by the way, you're going to get information like how old I am, what my gender is, what my reproductive status, and unfortunately for the peer, what my parasite load is. Mice can actually determine the parasite load of another mouse just from the smell of the urine. Talk about perceptive. Very briefly, rats have been shown to have metacognition. They know what they know, and they know what they don't know. And you're just going to have to read the book for the description of the very clever study that showed that. We may say then, okay, cool, wow, episodic memory, metacognition, that's cool, but I have all that too. I'm a human, I can do all those. In fact, I can do them better than they can. Actually, I would say with the waxworms and peanuts, recovering those, we probably couldn't. That's an area where a caching species probably better memory than us. We just have to remember where the fridge is. That's not so complicated, at least in our society. But what about an area of raw intelligence, or another area of raw intelligence in which animals exceed us profoundly? This is an example with our closest relative, the common chimpanzee. I'm now going to give you a little test that was done on chimpanzees and humans, and you're going to see the numbers 1 to 9 appear on the screen in a random array for 1 second. That's all you're going to get. I might be generous and give you 1.5 seconds, and then they're going to be replaced by white rectangles. And your task is, in your mind, to remember, try to count 1 through 9 in the order as to where the numbers were. And in fact, if you were sitting at a computer screen like the chimps are, you would need to push each rectangle in order. And if you get to 5 and then you get to 6 and that was actually a different number, it goes beep and you go back to square one and you don't get a little treat. That's the motivation for these animals to do the game, which they do for an hour or two. These are socialized chimps. They're in Japan. They live a quite nice setting, even though it is captive. This is really nice. So here you go. You ready? Numbers 1 to 9. Get ready. Think. Here we go. Okay, I gave you about a second and a bit there. As you can see, pretty tough. And in fact, studies show humans get to about 3 or 4 if they're having a good day. Chimpanzees, if they get 1/5 of a second, they get 1 to 9 about 90% of the time. If they get a second, they get it pretty much all the time. Young ones in particular, a little bit like us, sorry to say, as we get older, our memories don't do so quite well. So the youngsters over there are actually better than us, old folks, at doing this. But suffice it to say that a chimpanzee is astonishingly good at this. And now we have YouTube. You can actually go on YouTube and watch a Yumu, for instance, one of the young chimps who's particularly adept at this, doing this. And it's really quite humbling, I think, is maybe the best word to see this. And there's no ego in it. He's not proud of himself the way we would be. Although I think chimps are capable of pride and they have egos. They are individuals. He just casually does the little numbers, gets the thing, gets a little treat, and move on to the next one. The best memory brain of Britain, a guy named Ben Pridmore, went up against Ayumu. This is a guy who can memorize a shuffled deck of cards in 30 seconds. And he did about a third as well. So he's good at it, but just simply not as good as them. So we have to humbly admit that we are not even always the best at certain raw intelligence tasks. And I say that, it shouldn't matter that much, but we are an intellicentric species. This is a term I like to use. Intellicentric. We're very intelligence-focused. It's very much in our favor because we are smart. We're smart. We do some silly things with our brains, like make nuclear weapons, but we're very, very adept in our minds. But we're not always the smartest. What about awareness? I don't think I need to define awareness. It's sort of essentially in tune with your surroundings, alert, aware of certain things. Well, I used the word in the definition. I want to describe a study now briefly that requires me to walk from left to right. It doesn't really. I would normally, but I want to stay near the microphone, so I'll just describe it verbally. Elephants, these are long-lived animals. They live in matriarchal societies. The eldest know the most information. They know where that fruiting marula tree is 4 miles away, and they know when the water's available and where to go. And so they often walk large distances to get food or what have you, things that they need or want. A clever little study design, very simple. Scientists sometimes do strange things. They dug up fresh urine and they redeposited it. And if the elephants are moving from left to right, as you can see here, left to right, if they took urine from an elephant walking ahead up here a little way, and then this is the control, they dug it up and they quickly redeposited it in the path of these elephants. Elephants walking behind, on encountering the urine, well, it's a little bit like the mice. They use urine as a sort of a signature. They check it out, they sniff it, they twirl their trunks a little bit, and then they move on. But if they take urine from some elephants, say, walking a quarter mile back here, and then they quickly, surreptitiously shuttle it up here and deposit it in front, the elephants spent more time, did more trunk twists, essentially showed what the scientists called more surprise. They showed surprise in encountering this urine. And if you think about it, it doesn't fit expectation to find fresh urine up here from an elephant who, if you're aware of who they are, is walking somewhere back there. So it's a clever little way to show, or at least suggest pretty strongly, that elephants are keeping mental tabs on each other. And it's thought that actually they keep mental tabs on about 30 different elephants at any given time. We shouldn't be too surprised about that. They have a legendary memory, and they've earned that reputation. They do have excellent memories. They live in these social groups. They're long-lived. They're large brains. They're highly social, highly emotional, prone to post-traumatic stress disorder and that sort of thing. So they're aware. Until 2008, there were only a few animals, great apes, dolphins, and elephants, who'd passed the mirror self-recognition test. That is when you surreptitiously put a mark on the animal, on the forehead or somewhere where they can't see it on themselves, put them in front of a mirror. If they start threatening or look behind the mirror, that suggests that they don't recognize it themselves. Now, mind you, this is a bit of a stringent test. I mean, animals who've never been exposed to mirrors, some human society's never been exposed to mirrors. They often don't recognize it themselves right away. They will soon, but other animals will do that as well. Some animals, not many. And then in 2008, a study with a corvid, or close relative of those scrub jays we heard about earlier, showed that they too have mirror self-recognition. They put these birds who were put in front of a mirror with a yellow dot on their bib. They immediately started trying to remove it, either with their bill, some tried to use their feet. If they put a black dot there, which is camouflaged against their bib, this is the control, controlling for the possibility they might just feel it there, they didn't try and remove it. So it showed that they were actually recognizing it as themselves in the reflection. So we now have self-recognition in a non-mammal, in a bird in this particular case. Communication is another window onto animals' mental capacities. This is a chicken, one of those animals we kill 300 of a second. This is one of the more fortunate ones who gets to live outside. He's actually a rooster. This is just one of so many great examples about animal communication I could discuss. This was my specialty. I studied communication in bats. So I'll just describe a little bit about communication in chickens. They're known to have at least 30 communication calls. We might call them words, terms. And one of those, they have, for instance, small, medium-sized, and large aerial predator. And the birds understand that. And if they hear the medium-sized or small one in particular, they head out of there. They take cover because that's very dangerous. Roosters have a particular call they'll use in the barnyard or wherever they are, foraging around. It's called a come-hither call, or a food solicitation call, whatever you want to call it. But they know the call. And they only make it in the presence of hens, because it's intended for a hen. And so a rooster will make this call. The hen hears the call, knows what it means, comes running. The rooster looks very gallant, kind of points it out. Say it's a cricket or grasshopper, and the hen, if she finds it, she eats it. And if you're cynical enough, you'll know he's buying some credit for later, cashing in later. And it is later. It's not like, food mate. It's maybe a week later, which of course requires individual recognition and memory, so some cognitive skills going on there. Now, it gets a little Machiavellian. I love that word. It gets a little more complicated than that. Sometimes roosters will make this call when there's nothing there. It's a deception, and deception is fairly widespread in nature. So he doesn't find anything. He knows there's a hen nearby. And by the way, studies show that they won't make this deceptive call if hens are too nearby, presumably because they might detect the ruse and shun him. It doesn't pay to cry wolf too often if there's no wolf there. So he makes the call. Hen comes running, does the usual thing. Well, she finds nothing, but grasshoppers can move. Maybe it jumped away. So it's sort of a way, if you pardon the pun, of buying some credit on the cheap, of getting it without any particular cost to himself. Hens being just as perceptive as roosters, like I said, they will detect an inveterate cheater and they will not continue to come if he continues to make deceptive calls. This actually relates to morality, which is a very exciting new frontier in the study of animals. Virtue. A colleague of mine, Mark Beckhoff, is a leader in that area, and I have a chapter on virtue in here, because deception doesn't work if everybody's deceptive. If we all lied and cheated all the time, we would ignore each other. There would be no valuable information coming from them. It's because most of us are honest most of the time that the occasional cheat can get away with it. It pays off for them. So that sort of speaks to the intrinsic virtue in nature, and there's many other examples of that. I think I may get into that briefly in a couple of minutes. Pleasure is something that's been neglected by scientists. There are at least 23 journals with the word pain in the title of the journal, scholarly journals dedicated to the study of pain. You can guess how many journals there are with the word pleasure in the title. Zippo, none, that's right. I don't know how to say zero in native Hawaiian, but I love all the Hawaiian words here, by the way. Anyway, pleasure, neglected. So that's why I was excited to think of, hey, let's write a book about animal pleasure, which resulted in my first book called Pleasurable Kingdom, came out 4 years ago, and now The Exultant Ark, which is a pictorial treatment of the same subject. Very briefly, we should expect animals with strong senses, products of evolution. As I like to put it, in a carrot and stick world, pleasure is nature's carrot. We should expect animals like this little runty piglet to be enjoying that. Now we look at that picture, it looks like the piglet is. Well, he or she, actually it's Clementine, she was enjoying it very much. Some animals show pleasure in their behavior. Goats have nice built-in back scratchers and they will use them. By the way, this is a fortunate goat at one of the animal sanctuaries in the U.S., in California, farm sanctuary. And I like to show this slide. It's not an animal, but it's a beautiful illustration of the role of pleasure in coevolution between plants and animals. Plants have evolved to try and get their seeds elsewhere. It behooves them to get the seeds away. Why? Because a seed that just drops below the parent has to compete with the parent for water, nutrients, light. And so some plants have seeds like I saw today, like cotton-like seeds that blow in the wind. Others have plants have evolved seeds that stick to animals' fur or clothing, and we pluck it off later and drop it. Perfect. We did exactly what the plant wanted us to do. We've moved the seed somewhere else because we're mobile. Fruit are just another illustration of that. And boy, what a rich illustration it is. There's so many types of fruiting and flowering plants. Very, very successful. By far and away, the flowering plants, the fruiting plants are the most successful of all the plants in the world right now. I forget 60,000 maybe species. And look at fruit. You think about it. It's bright colors, nice smell, delicious taste, and a big nutritional reward. And if there's any raw food vegans out here, or just anyone, I mean, fruit is very easy to eat. It goes down easy. It's easy on the stomach and the palate. Why? Because we evolved as primates. We evolved to eat fruit. I mean, we're frugivores, not strictly, but fruit have been a big part of our diet historically. So little wonder that it's healthy for us, within reason. Don't eat too much, maybe. But anyway, so I like to show that because without even showing a picture of an animal, we can appreciate the importance of pleasure in nature. It wouldn't do to mention animal pleasure without mentioning sex, and suffice to say that there are children here, so I thought we should have anonymous elephants. But so often the treatment of animals in nature documentaries, if they touch on sex at all, it's very perfunctory and passionless. But actually a wonderful book published in 1999 called Biological Exuberance, it's a 750-page tome which reviews non-procreative sexual behavior in just mammals and birds. If you look at that book, it will allay any illusion that you might have that animals are not highly motivated to engage in sexual behavior. There's a great deal of shenanigans going on out there that is manifestly not going to produce young. We may say that, oh, well, they're just confused. Well, they're confused and happy at the same time. So suffice to say that animals are much more sexual than we often give them credit for. The sense of touch, it's the most physical of the senses. We love the touch of a beloved other. And studies show, there's a wonderful new book called Made for Each Other. It's about the human-animal bond. And petting a pet, I mean, we've used that term pet, or maybe more politically correct, companion animal. You know, we call them pets. Well, it's about stroking them. We love the feel of that fur. In fact, I'm probably getting a little shot of oxytocin right now just from simply going through the motions and imagining I'm petting Micah or Megan or someone's friendly dog. Seriously. I mean, if you tell someone to think of the smell of a banana, their brains start lighting up, parts of the brain that are active when you're actually smelling a real banana. So our brains are pretty interesting things. And I'm not just talking about human brains. Their brains work that way too. These two Japanese macaques I photographed 15 years ago, 20 years ago in Japan, They are experiencing oxytocin, endorphin release right now, right at that time, because they're grooming each other, and it feels great for the groomer and the groomee. And the exultant arc, I give examples of touch, sex, play, food, some of these other domains of pleasure. Just one last parting shot on pleasure. And this touches on something that I dedicate 1 to 2 chapters of in Second Nature, because it's a real issue for me. So often we present nature in a sort of a glass, half-empty way. It's nature red in tooth and claw, struggle against time, survival of the fittest, this kind of ruthless Darwinian type stuff. And I don't like to connect Darwin with that, because Darwin was a very open-minded guy, and he was a product of his time, but a lot of people spun the whole natural selection and evolution thing in a negative way, as in like it gave us license to do with others as we please, back to might makes right, colonialism and slavery. Look, that's nature's way. You have the power, you do it, you take over. Actually, there's a lot more goodness in nature, and in my writings, I try to emphasize that. And I love this slide. This slide, I wanted to have it in the Exultant Arc. I couldn't get the photographer to respond to my email, so it never ended up in there. But this is a phenomenon in one of the national parks in Uganda. I think it may be seen elsewhere, and there are parallel types of behavior in fish and other animals. These are small predators, mongooses. They obviously don't prey on warthogs here. Warthogs are too big. But what they do is they have this cleaning routine, this spa treatment type thing. Guess I haven't seen it. I don't know the details, but a warthog's wandering along and sees the mongoose, and maybe the mongooses give an invitation or something. But the warthog flops on his or her side, and the mongooses swarm over the warthog, presumably getting bits of parasites and sloughing skin and then salt and whatever little tidbits, so they're getting a little treat, I guess. Not sure I'd be so keen on that, but they like it. And the warthog, for his or her part, is just in bliss. I mean, we're pretty good at reading mammal faces, and if that doesn't say bliss, I don't know what it says. The legs raised, all cooperative. The pigs on the sanctuary I go to, close relatives of warthogs, same family. I rub their bellies, they change position and get up. They want to feel that. It feels great. And so again, oxytocin, mutual oxytocin and endorphins. Pleasure is a wonderfully self-reinforcing, mutual type of thing. Okay, I mentioned virtue very quickly. I've already been yakking away for 37 minutes. I don't want to go too far over my time. Virtue is an exciting new frontier in the study of animal behavior. And think about being a social species, how restrained we are. And social species like monkeys, they have to consider others. You have to hold back. You don't just slap someone or do them an ill. It doesn't pay off. The theory of reciprocal altruism, which explains a lot of virtue in nature, the idea that if you do a good deed to someone now, they'll maybe repay the favor later. Back to the chickens, food for sex. So animals are restrained. Just one anecdote, a friend of mine was in South Africa, the Kalahari Desert, on an extremely hot day. It was very dry there, naturally, it's a desert. She had a mug of water, she put it out, and within a couple of minutes these red-headed finches and sociable weavers arrived, a mixed flock. That's interesting in itself. And they spent about 10 minutes guzzling away at this water. Did they squabble? Did they fight? No. That may happen occasionally. Hey, it happens with humans as well. Bar fights, etc. And then they kind of essentially amicably had this water, and then they headed off on their way. So just a little anecdotal illustration of how animals show restraint, patience, cooperation, and it behooves them to do so. What about fairness? Fairness awareness? Good God, that's got to be something. Surely we're the only ones of that. But actually the roots of morality, things like fairness, are being shown in monkeys and dogs in experiments like this, where 2 dogs are side by side. These are dogs who know the shake the paw routine. And by the way, this is a Hungarian study. It's always a bit humbling to see dogs who understand Hungarian. I don't understand a word of it. Essentially, in the exercise, repeatedly, the one person offers a hand to offer the dog to shake, back and forth. And if there's no food involved, they're happy to do that, maybe 30 times or so. Dogs are sociable, and they love to please, so they offer the paw. But in this situation, you start introducing food, and you make it inequitable. Hijinks ensue. The dog on the right, as you can see here, has been getting a treat every time he shakes the paw. The dog on the left, however, has not. And this is after about 12 trials. Dog on the left on not getting a treat, and witnessing the other dog, even more aghast, witnessing that the other dog is getting a treat, starts to refuse, looking away and not holding out the paw. The other dog's all ready to go. Come on, let's have another one here. I'm ready. By the way, bits of bread and sausage in this bowl. It looks like an ashtray. So dogs, now, that's one thing. Now, what's the experience of the dog? That's another question. And we may say, well, is it indignance or is it some other emotion? And that's an interesting question in itself. And science may tease that out. Who knows? We'll see. But it's the kind of study that's really intriguing and shows things that we wouldn't really have ascribed to a dog until now, and now we're asking these kinds of questions. So to sum up, before I go into my sort of closing section, animals are sentient. They take an interest in the surroundings. They're perceptive. They care about life. They have individual preferences. They have moments of joy. They have moments of difficulty. They can feel pleasure and they can suffer. So I just want to mention a little bit about prejudices. We have prejudice about animals. In particular, I'm going to focus on one issue here, that is the use of animals for human consumption, meat. One of the prejudices we have about turkeys is that it's actually an old myth, and it's complete. I hate the term wives' tale, so I'm a feminist. It's a complete old husband's tale. They're thought to like drown from looking up at the sky when it's raining. I don't know where that came from, but it's completely ludicrous. And it's a real shortcoming of human creativity that we would come up with that. By the way, these 7 turkeys looking up at the sky, they're just babies. They're about 4 months old, but because they've been selectively bred to grow so fast and can barely support their weight, this is their first time ever outside at Farm Sanctuary in New York State on the mainland. Yes, they're looking skyward. In fact, the person who cares for them was wondering what caught their attention. What are they looking at? She looked up, didn't see anything. And then they're still looking up, and she looked up, and maybe they're just enjoying the sky. And then she noticed a little jet moving, and she could see their gaze was following this tiny speck in the sky. Very, very alert to aerial predators or aerial movement. It's very adaptive for them. Even though they'd never been outside, they had it in them to do that. Another bias we have about turkeys is that, well, just generally that they're stupid. I have 2 words for anyone who thinks that a male turkey is stupid for mounting a stuffed model of a female and trying to mate with her. Sheep, another farm animal, or farmed animals, we might call them, commonly viewed as dim-witted followers. In fact, studies show that sheep remember the faces of 50 or more members of their original flock 2 years after they were taken out of their original flock, just from single photographs front on, or profile photographs of sheep. They show them a couple of hundred photos, and maybe 1 in 4 at random order are from their original flock, and you can teach sheep to tell you when they recognize that. They remember them. So they got very good face recognition skills, very good memories. We're good at those. We're very good at face recognition and memory too. And by the way, sheep would much rather go through a door that has a smiling human face or a contented sheep face than a picture of an angry-looking human face, or a sheep who's very hungry, looks much the same to us, but they recognize the difference, and they would much prefer to go through a door with the happy, contented sheep than the hungry and probably stressed one. So emotional valence they can detect. This is John, I forget his last name. Just his name goes away from me sometimes. But anyway, he's a British ethologist. And this is something he said. I think this is a really, really important point, that intelligence does not map smoothly onto sentience. And this is his way of putting it. An 18th century British cleric named Humphrey Primmet said something much the same effect, albeit more erudite 17th century language, 18th century language. What's the deal here? Well, this is the biggest issue that I wanted to touch on, our consumption of animals, meat. I have to talk about this. Of course, as a vegetarian society, it's very relevant. But when I speak to audiences, whoever they are, I hit this issue because we need to change this issue. People are eating way too much meat. Well, they're eating meat at all is a problem for many of us, I think. This is a big issue. And I was asked to talk about a little bit about that. Why vegan, the title of my talk. Why am I vegan? Well, sometimes I ask school kids, I say, what's the most dangerous weapon on the planet? And they have good answers, nuclear bombs or guns or knives or whatever. Knives is close. I'd say it's this one, the fork, the table fork, the benign-looking table fork, because with this tool we convey into our mouths foodstuffs that are going to kill us if we keep eating them. I'm talking about animal products, and of course the extra damage we do to the animals to get them on our plates. And it is very sad and profound to me that the closest most Americans today get to a sheep or a chicken is on the end of one of those. And I have to add chopsticks, because China is now the number 1 meat-consuming nation in the world. It's doubled its meat consumption in the last decade. Actually that was of a couple of years ago. Consumes about 1/4 of all human meat consumption, by dint primarily of its larger population. Americans per capita still eat a lot more meat than Chinese do. It's just that there's a lot more people living in China. So what are the implications? 3 or 4 big ones I want to hit on. I shouldn't say 3 or 4 if they're big. There's 4 or 3. Which is it? I think it's 4 that I wanted to touch on here. The environmental impacts of meat consumption. Land use, the biggest user of land, in fact, more than half of all human land use, I forget the exact figure, is for animal agriculture. I think it's 70% of all freshwater use is for animal agriculture, freshwater consumption. These obscure chemicals, not that obscure, they're very large amounts of them. We hear all about carbon dioxide as a planet-warming compound, but actually nitrous oxide here, and animal agriculture is the largest producer of it, of any industry, and methane also here. These, you see the numbers, 300 times and 23 times, that's relative to carbon dioxide as the potency of a greenhouse gas. So animal agriculture is a really big contributor to greenhouse gas emissions, and you may have heard before that all the transportation sector, according to rigorous Nobel Prize winning studies and research, all the cars, plane rides, train trips, boat rides combined amount to less greenhouse gas emission contributions than does animal agriculture alone. In fact, the number from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change was about 18% compared to 13%. A couple of World Bank scientists published a paper last year that they're suggesting that because they left out some other factors, it may be actually over 50% contribution of all the greenhouse gas emissions, 50% or more may be attributable to animal agriculture. Suffice it to say, it's a very, very large amount, and most Americans, most people, are only just beginning to become aware of the environmental issue about meat consumption. So don't hold back on letting people know about that. People need to know about that because some people may not like the animal rights idea, even though they hate animal suffering. Very few people like animal suffering. They do respond to the environment. Most people want to be thought of as environmentalists, so that's a very important issue. And just as an ecologist myself, I want to point this out. Why is meat consumption so high in greenhouse gas contribution? Well, why are there a lot fewer eagles than there are geese? Bald eagle, Canada geese, they're about the same size, they're both birds. Ecosystems cannot support anywhere near as many predators. High on the food chain, very inefficient. A lot of energy is lost in trophic levels, in food webs or food chains, if you like. And so that energy is lost to heat and other things. It simply can't sustain a lot of meat eaters. Meat eating is relatively inefficient. And so humans, 6 billion odd humans, eating at the top of the food chain is very, very hard on the planet, and we're noticing the effects. So that's the environment. Human health, well, we know about pesticides. If you eat high on the food chain, you're also getting a concentration of pesticides and other things. For anyone at the back who may not be able to read, it's the woman is saying to her, I guess, husband, I warned you about the hormones in all that meat and dairy you eat. And as you can see, he's sporting not only nipples on his belly, but he's also got a cow's tail. So there's that issue. Then there's the human health. Now, these are poor slides to see, but you don't need to see the countries. The dots are different countries, but you can see the pattern. And the pattern here is total fat intake. And this is, by the way, animal fat. This particular one is breast cancer rates. You can see a very clear correlation with fat intake, okay? Now, here, this next slide, a little confusing here. Female colon cancer incidence and daily meat consumption. Again, a clear pattern. If you were to draw a regression line through that, it would look about like that. So as the meat consumption goes up, colon cancer rate in women goes up as well. You'd see a similar pattern in men. This one is association of cow's milk consumption and incidence of type 1 diabetes. Diabetes, the new epidemic. It's estimated by some now that in the next few decades, 50% of Americans will have type 2 diabetes. That is an absurd epidemic. It's related to diet. And just 20 years ago, it wasn't even being connected to diet. It's more likely to break if you're getting more, ironically, more protein from animal consumption. And that kind of flies in the face of a lot of common assumptions people make about animal protein and health, and bone breaks and osteoporosis and things like that. So we've got environment and healthcare. This one is often neglected. Economy. It costs a lot of money to feed people on meat. The subsidization of the meat industry is huge. And you've heard, way back, John Robbins in his book Diet for New America estimated, I think, that a hamburger actually cost about $35 a hamburger if you factored in all the subsidies and all the extra money going in. Suffice it to say, it's a very expensive way to produce food. And there's another huge cost here, and that's the cost of healthcare. This number here, $60 billion a year, is from a study that was published in 1996. And this is an estimate, but it was a scientifically published estimate published in the journal Preventive Medicine. $60 billion a year estimated the cost of treating a medical cost attributable to meat consumption alone. I'm sure the number is a lot higher today. This was even before the diabetes epidemic. So now we have environment, healthcare, and the economic implications. And finally, the ethics, just one brief slide. We cannot continue to treat animals like so many blocks of wood, and fortunately some states are outlawing this, farrowing crates, this sort of thing. This is just simply wrong and terrible for the animals. And here's the key word here: choice. Individual choice. The pig in the diner is saying to the waiter, "The special sounds good, but can I substitute the pork chop for a fried chunk of your left buttock?" It's a sort of a light way of getting to the very heavy, serious point that we all, as autonomous individuals, can make a choice in what we eat. And here's an example of someone who can, the other thing is the individual action and the empowerment of going vegetarian or vegan, how that can make a difference in the world. Jill Robinson, she's a British national. She saw these horrible farms which are still going on in China and Korea and other parts of Southeast Asia and Vietnam. This moon bear had been in there for 15 years with bile being drained. His name is Jasper, and here's Jasper today. He's a very happy bear. He's been released. He's one of several hundred now who've been released from these horrible cages. Talk about resilience, animals' capacity for resilience. Some of these animals have very severe mental and physical handicaps, but they now, the ones who've been rescued, are living a much, much better life. And it's just one illustration of the power of good that an individual can do. And so I lay out a challenge to you as individuals. If you eat meat or you eat animal products, and I realize in this audience there may not be very many of you, go vegetarian for 30 days. Just 30 days. 30 days. At the end of 30 days, make your decision. You'll have had enough time for your palate to get used to not having animal products and for your palate to get used to some new foods. Do yourself a favor and buy yourself a cookbook in the meantime, a vegetarian or vegan cookbook. If you're already vegetarian but not vegan, go vegan for 30 days. Try that. I spoke at Cornell University 2 months ago, and someone emailed me. I was very glad to hear this. He said, "I really liked your talk. I went vegan for 30 days. I'm never going back, and my wife is vegan too." So there's an individual who put it to the test, and he had the open-mindedness to stick with it, and it's not hard to stick to because it's actually great food. And so I just send you out that challenge if you're not already vegetarian or vegan. Give it 30 days and see how it goes. And it's really important. It can make a difference to the world, and it certainly makes a difference to all those animals. They're out there watching us. I hope you'll do the right thing. Thanks for listening to me tonight. Thanks. I'd be happy to take any questions. Hand at the back, yes? Why do I think the Chinese are demanding more meat? I'm not so sure they are aware of that. Oh, yes, sure, the health implications, they may be well aware of that. I don't really know. I think my answer would be the same answer that many people probably would give here, which is probably this perception that the Western diet is the diet to go for. The higher meat's better, it's got status. It's so hard to get rid of all that old baggage we have about animal products in the diet. But we need to work on that. People, and I think the health and the economic information will go a long way in making people realize it's simply not sustainable. So, but that's my guess, but I don't know the specifics about the dynamics of that. Some people here may know better than I do.
The World Bank is part of it. Have you heard of the China Smallholder program?
Bill is saying the World Bank is part of it. Have you ever heard of the China Smallholding Program? I haven't, but I think the general point here is, of course, there's a lot of complicity in getting the animal agriculture industry wants their products to be sold as widely and consumed as greatly as possible. It's a little bit like the smoking industry, where smoking has really been taking some hits over here in North America, but they're making up for it by selling their products overseas and getting people over there to light up. Any other questions? Okay, if that's it, I will be around, happy to sign books if you want to purchase one. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Jonathan Balcom, for coming here to Hawaii and for giving us such an informative and insightful talk about the nature of animals, and giving us a talk also about the importance of making the choice of a plant-based diet, not just for ourselves, our own health and that of the environment and the world, but for the animals also. Thank you very much. Please do take advantage of the wonderful vegan refreshments provided for us by Down to Earth. And mahalo to all of you for coming tonight. Have a safe return home. Good evening.
This program is brought to you by the Vegetarian Society of Hawaii, a nonprofit organization dedicated to sharing with the community the many benefits of a vegetarian diet. Free monthly meetings include vegetarian experts found locally and on the mainland, quick and easy cooking demonstrations, and healthful and delicious food samples. Members enjoy an informative quarterly newsletter, social activities, and discounts at many vegetarian-friendly restaurants and health food stores. For an application, call 944-8344. That's 944-8344. Or visit our website at www.vsh.org. vsh.org.